1408 local time, 26 miles south of Kharg Island. A U.S. Navy Seahawk drops to 50 feet over the Persian Gulf and turns north to intercept a supertanker the size of a floating apartment complex. She is riding high. Empty tanks. Red plates showing above her waterline. Her transponder claims she is bound for a port in Iraq. She is not. In the next 11 minutes, the crew of that helicopter will be shot at by 4 separate weapons. A hand-cranked autocannon on a rusted platform. A shoulder-fired missile with a 2-color seeker. A battery of surface-to-air interceptors worth roughly $1 million per round. And a swarm of speedboats designed to be lost by the dozen. The single weapon that comes closest to killing them costs Iran about $20,000. One man carries it up a ladder. At the end of the 11 minutes, the tanker will be dead in the water, permanently disabled, and nobody on board will be hurt. The 2 missiles that did it cost roughly $300,000. The cargo they were protecting is worth close to $140 million. How does the world's most expensive navy sink the world's largest ships with the world's cheapest missiles without killing a single sailor? The answer is not better technology. The answer is a targeting decision made months earlier inside a compartment on a different tanker that changed how the United States now attacks vessels at sea. This is the story of an economy built on running blockades. Of a commercial fleet that changes names the way most people change passwords. Of a coastal defense network paid for in oil money, hidden inside decommissioned platforms, and defeated in the end by a man on a walkway with a pair of binoculars and solar-powered radio. Is the story of a 10-foot steel box 130 feet above the water that has quietly become the most valuable target in the Persian Gulf. According to open-source tracking published by shipping intelligence firms and by reporting from outlets like the Financial Times and Lloyd's List, more than 300 tankers currently operate in what analysts call the shadow fleet. Vessels moving sanctioned crude through opaque ownership chains, flag of convenience registries, and false destination broadcasts. The Belma, the ship at the center of this story, is one of them. So were the ships she used to be, back when she went by other names. Here is how the trick works. Every merchant vessel in the world broadcasts an automatic identification signal. Think of it as the marine equivalent of a license plate. The destination on that signal is typed in by hand by whoever feels like typing it. The name of the ship can be painted over between voyages. The flag can be swapped in a week. The owning company can be dissolved on a Tuesday and reincorporated on a Wednesday under a name that means nothing. But one number cannot be changed. The International Maritime Organization number is stamped into the hull for life. Weld it, sand it, burn it. It comes back on the next inspection. The vessel now called Belma has an IMO number 9289491 that ties her back through 4 previous identities. Aquarius Voyager, Baron Aquarius, Leonore, Bendigo, and 6 different flags. She is a burner phone the size of an office tower. The SIM changes every voyage. The chassis does not. That single number is why an American crew chief, leaning out of the door of a helicopter, can read a hull with binoculars and know within 3 seconds that the ship in front of him is a repeat customer. All of the paperwork stops mattering. Paperwork works right up until a Navy crew looks through a pane of glass and reads the hull for himself. That is what the Seahawk crew is closing on this afternoon. And to understand why the encounter unfolds the way it does, why a machine gun fails, why a shoulder-fired missile misses right in front of the door gunner's face, why the most expensive interceptor in Iran's arsenal spends $1 million killing seabirds, you first have to understand what Kharg Island actually is. How the shadow fleet built itself around a single loading jetty. Why Iran's air defense network was. To understand why the Belma is drawing fire this afternoon, you have to go back to the mid-1960s. Kharg Island is a piece of rock roughly the size of Central Park, sitting about 25 miles off the Iranian coast, just deep enough inside the Persian Gulf that a tanker leaving it has to cross a lot of open water before she is anywhere useful. In 1960, that rock was fishermen and salt flats. By 1969, it was the largest crude oil export terminal on Earth. The reason was simple engineering. Kharg sits inside a natural deep water channel. Supertankers, vessels with drafts of 70 feet or more, cannot dock at most coastal ports without dredging that would take a decade and a fortune. Kharg was ready-made. The National Iranian Oil Company built 2 enormous facilities on its eastern shore, the T Jetty and the Sea Island Terminal, capable of loading multiple very large crude carriers simultaneously. At its peak, before the revolution, the terminal was pushing more than 6 million barrels of oil into hulls every single day. Then came the war. For 8 years, from 1980 to 1988, the Iran-Iraq War ran through Kharg. The Iraqis flew hundreds of sorties against the terminal, targeting jetties, storage tanks, control buildings, and the loading arms themselves. Iran rebuilt everything. Then the Iraqis flew more sorties. Then Iran rebuilt it again. By the end of the war, Kharg was less a piece of infrastructure than a piece of national identity. It was the artery. If it stopped pumping, the country stopped functioning. That equation has not fundamentally changed in 40 years. Today, Kharg still handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude oil exports. Estimates vary because Iran deliberately does not publish them, but analysts working from satellite imagery and tanker tracking put the share at somewhere north of 90%. Everything else combined is a rounding error. Pipeline exports across land borders exist, but are small. Small terminals on the mainland exist, but are small. Kharg is the story. And here is why that matters for the Belma. When the United States and its European partners reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil in the late 2010s, the theory was that if you cut Iran out of the international banking system, out of the international insurance market, out of the shipping registries maintained by the major flag states, then the physical oil simply could not move. Nobody would insure a cargo they could not legally clear. No captain would sign for a voyage he could not legally invoice. The tap, in theory, would close by itself. That is not what happened. What happened is that a parallel economy grew up around the tap instead. Vessels that had been operating in the daylight, flagged in Panama or Liberia, insured through Lloyd's, tracked continuously by international AIS receivers, began to disappear from the paperwork and reappear under new names, new flags, new owners. The insurance came from small mutual clubs nobody had heard of. The financing was quietly denominated in currencies the sanctions regime did not touch. And the ships themselves started doing something quite specific. They started turning off their transponders in the strait between Kharg and international waters, waiting hours or days in radio silence, then re-emerging with new destinations typed in by hand. Sometimes the destination was Fujairah, sometimes Singapore, sometimes a port that, on close inspection, did not have berths deep enough to receive a loaded supertanker. Nobody at the receiving port was expecting them. The transponder did not care. By the mid-2020s, according to Windward and other maritime intelligence firms, the fleet moving sanctioned crude out of Kharg had grown into the hundreds. It had a name in the trade press, the Dark Fleet, the Shadow Fleet, the Ghost Fleet, but among the people who actually enforced sanctions, it had a simpler description. A logistics company with plausible deniability priced into the barrel. The Belma is a member in good standing. Under her current name, she has completed multiple voyages out of Kharg. Under her previous names, the count runs into the dozens. Multiplied across the fleet, the math gets uncomfortable. A single loaded VLCC carries roughly 2 million barrels of crude. At a heavily discounted sanction price, call it $50 to $60 a barrel. That is on the order of $100 million in a single haul, on a single voyage, from a single terminal that the Iranian state controlled. The repainting is the visible part of the operation, is not the hard part. A crew of 8 men with drop cloths and industrial rollers can change the name on the stern of a supertanker in a long weekend. Add the new port of registry underneath in 3-foot letters. Wait for the paint to dry. Sign the paperwork. The vessel that sailed as Aquarius Voyager out of one anchorage arrives at the next as Baron Aquarius, then as Leonor, then as Bendigo, then as Belma. Same hull, same engines, same crew in most cases, even the same catering supplier. Underneath all of that, the numbers stay put. But there is a system to why the paint keeps changing anyway. Sanctions enforcement works on the principle of ownership disclosure. When a specific company is designated by the U.S. Treasury Department, or by the European Union, or by the United Kingdom, that company's vessels are frozen out of the international system in a very specific way. Ports refuse them. Insurers refuse them. Classification societies, the private organizations that certify a ship's seaworthiness, refuse to renew their paperwork. On paper, a designated vessel becomes a floating pariah. But the designation attaches to the corporate name and the beneficial owner, not to the hull. So the game is to change the corporate name and, on paper, the beneficial owner, faster than the designation can catch up. In practice, a shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands sells the ship to a shell company registered in the Marshall Islands, which then leases the ship to a shell company registered in Comoros, which reflags her under a small West African registry and lists her operator as an office in Dubai that turns out, when investigators visit it, to be a laminated sign on a locked door. Every step is legal. Every step, individually, would take months to unwind in court. And the ship, meanwhile, is loading crude at Kharg. The flag registries themselves are part of the ecosystem. Traditional flag of convenience states, Panama, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, have gradually tightened their standards as U.S. pressure grew. So the trade migrated. It moved to registries in Cameroon, Gabon, Sao Tome, the Cook Islands, and a handful of jurisdictions in Africa and the South Pacific that either could not police the fleet flying their flag or did not particularly want to. Some of those registries are believed by investigators to be run out of offices in Dubai and Athens, in buildings that have nothing to do with the country they nominally represent. The insurance is the last piece. Legitimate protection and indemnity insurance, the P&I clubs that cover the enormous liabilities involved in operating a supertanker, will not touch a shadow fleet vessel. So the fleet self-insures through clubs based in Russia, in India, and in a handful of other jurisdictions that do not share information with the West. When one of these ships runs aground or leaks or catches fire, there's often nobody with the money or the legal exposure to clean it up. The costs, in that case, tend to fall on whoever is unlucky enough to have the coastline nearby. If any of this offends your sense of how international shipping is supposed to work, you are already ahead of most of the people who watch the tankers move. Which is a good moment to say, if you're getting something out of this breakdown, hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel get in front of more people who care about how these systems actually operate. Now, back to Kharg. The Belma is loaded and moving. Her paperwork says one thing. Her hull number says another. Her transponder at this moment is broadcasting a destination up in Iraq that she has no intention of reaching. And in about 40 minutes, an American helicopter is going to close on her and start reading. Which brings us to the second half of the equation, because the Shadow Fleet is only one side of the trade. The other side is the wall of steel and radar and shoulder-fired missiles that Iran has spent the better part of 30 years building along its coast, specifically to make it dangerous for anyone to try to enforce a blockade against a ship exactly like this one. That wall is not designed the way most American planners might expect. It is not, at its core, a wall of expensive systems. It is a wall of cheap ones wired together by cheaper ones, backstopped by very expensive ones that almost never get to fire. And that is precisely why, this afternoon, it almost works. Iran's air defense doctrine did not emerge from a strategic think tank. It emerged from the war. For most of the 1980s, Iran had almost no functional air force. The pre-revolution military had been built around American aircraft, F-14 Tomcats, F-4 Phantoms, F-5 Freedom Fighters, and after 1979, spare parts vanished overnight. Pilots defected or were purged. Maintenance manuals stopped arriving. When the Iraqi Air Force began flying strikes over Iranian territory, the Iranians could not answer them in the air, and they could not stop them on the ground. The lesson of that decade shaped everything that came after. If you cannot own the sky, you saturate it. You accept that any single air defense system will eventually be destroyed, and you build many of them, cheap, distributed, mobile. You make each one radiate for as short a time as possible, so that even when it fires, the enemy does not learn exactly where it is. You put decoys next to real launchers. You put real launchers inside decommissioned oil platforms. You buy the best long-range Russian system you can afford, and you build a domestic clone of it, and then you buy shoulder-fire missiles by the thousand. And you drill and drill and drill until the crew of a rusted anti-aircraft gun on a wellhead knows exactly where to lead a helicopter that comes in low. At the top of that pyramid sits the imported Russian long-range interceptor system, the S-300 PMU-2, delivered to Iran in the mid-2010s under a contract that had been signed, canceled, renegotiated, and finally honored across 3 Russian administrations. It owns everything above about 100 feet, out to a range of roughly 150 miles, with missiles that leave the tube at close to Mach 6. From launch warning, a helicopter operating in its engagement zone gets about 45 seconds to react. 45 seconds of maximum climb. In a Seahawk, buys about 1,200 feet of altitude. That is a foot race against a bullet. The bullet wins. Underneath the S-300 sits the Iranian-built Bavar-373, a domestic system developed to look, on paper, exactly like an S-300 while using components Iran can manufacture without importing anything sensitive. Its centerpiece is a flat radar panel, one of a small handful of active electronically scanned array radars anywhere outside the arsenals of NATO, Russia, and China. No dish, nothing spinning. A few thousand tiny transmitters steering the beam electronically, the way a stadium jumbotron moves a picture without a single bulb going anywhere. Against a fighter jet, The Bavar system is credible. It has a detection range of roughly 90 miles and can track and engage multiple targets simultaneously with an interceptor called the Sayyad-3 at ranges reported around 200 kilometers. Against a helicopter flying at 50 feet, none of those numbers mean a thing. The reason is the shape of the Earth itself. A radar beam travels in a straight line. The surface of the ocean does not. From an antenna 20 feet above sea level, looking at a target flying at 50 feet, the Earth's curve puts them out of line of sight until they are about 14 miles apart. Anything farther is hidden behind what pilots call the horizon shadow, a hill made of water. A machine that stays down inside that shadow is, for practical purposes, invisible to the best radar in the region. So the low-altitude problem is real. And Iran solved it, in classic Iranian fashion, twice over. First, it built a very long, very low-frequency radar system called Ghadar. Long horizontal antenna arrays strung out along the coast, working at the bottom of the VHF band on radio waves about 33 feet long. Waves that size reflect hardest-off objects roughly their own size, and a Seahawk helicopter is 54 feet from rotor tip to rotor tip. It rings like a church bell. The catch, because there's always one, is that Ghadar cannot really aim. It knows a target is in the neighborhood. It cannot tell a missile crew which house on the block. Its picture of the sky is measured not in meters but in miles. A helicopter it detects sits somewhere inside a box roughly 17 miles across. That is enough to know an aircraft is in the neighborhood. Is not enough to shoot at it, which means the top of the pyramid, on its own, is not enough. You need something down at street level to close the loop between there's a helicopter somewhere out there, and here is the bearing, here is the range. You need somebody or something that can actually see the target with the last-mile precision the radar cannot deliver. That something in the Iranian design is not another radar, is not a satellite. Every visible structure along the northern Persian Gulf coast that could plausibly hold a lookout does. Fishing boats with radios, salt-flat huts with binoculars, decommissioned oil platforms that have not pumped a barrel of crude since the 1980s, but still have 4 rusted legs, a walkway 100 feet above the water, and enough shade for a man with a thermos to sit through a 12-hour shift. Ex-military volunteers, oil workers on rotating shifts, teenagers with a solar panel zip-tied to a railing and a handheld radio charged off it. None of this shows up in any published military document. All of it is real. The pattern is very old. The Iranians call it, informally, the watching net. The Americans call it, less formally, a nightmare. What it does, in practice, is shrink the 17-mile Ghadar box down to something that fits on a spotter's radio call. A tail number read off through binoculars. A bearing. A rough altitude. Half a minute of chatter on frequencies no receiver in the theater is monitoring, and suddenly the best radar in the country knows where to point. The lookout costs nothing. The radio costs nothing. The solar panel costs about $30. And the effect, cumulatively, is that the entire Persian Gulf coastline becomes a single, enormous analog sensor, powered by curiosity and cheap electronics. That is the top of the sensor pyramid. The bottom of the weapons pyramid is even simpler. Every Iranian coastal position, from the border with Iraq down to the Strait of Hormuz, carries some version of the same shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapon. Older units carry variants of the Soviet Urigla or Strela. Newer positions carry a domestic Iranian development called the Masay, and its export cousin the Masood, a weapon most Western analysts had not paid much attention to until very recently. The Masood's second-generation seeker reads heat in 2 separate infrared bands at once, throwing away anything that burns bright in one and dim in the other, which is precisely what a magnesium flare does. Think of a bouncer checking IDs under 2 different lights. The fake glows wrong under the second one every time. A helicopter's usual defense against a shoulder-fired missile is to dump flares in a spreading stream and pray. Against a dual-band seeker, the flare stream does nothing. The seeker looks at the flare, decides it burns wrong under the second color, and steers around it toward the exhaust of the actual aircraft. The math on that missile is worth stopping on for a second. A single Masood costs Iran roughly $20,000, call it the price of a used car. A U.S. Navy MH-60 or Seahawk costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million fully outfitted. Crewed, it carries 3 trained aviators representing many years and many millions of dollars of training. That is a ratio of about 1,500 to 1 on the airframe alone. Ignore the aircrew, and you're still throwing a Toyota at a Lamborghini and asking who gets to keep driving. That ratio, the asymmetric price of the shot, is the entire idea. Every element of Iran's coastal doctrine has been optimized for it. The rusted autocannon on a wellhead platform, the shoulder-fired missile under a fisherman's net, the pattern of never radiating a targeting radar for more than a few seconds so that the American anti-radiation missiles do not learn a signature to hunt. It is a defense architecture that assumes, from the first day of planning, that it will lose most of its individual pieces in any real engagement, and is priced accordingly. Even the swarming speedboats, the PACAP-class fast attack craft Iran manufactures by the dozen and has been photographed massing in the Strait of Hormuz for 2 decades, are built on the same premise. 50 feet of hull, 45 knots on a good chop, a light anti-ship missile along one rail, and a rocket pod forward. Not survivable. Not meant to be. Meant to force any American targeter to pick which one to shoot at, and to give the other 3 a free run at the flank. If you want more breakdowns of asymmetric systems like this one, subscribe. Next episode picks up a related thread. That is, the architecture Iran has built is what the Seahawk is flying into this afternoon. And it is not, in the end, what stops the Belma. What stops the Belma is a decision made in an American targeting cell earlier this year in the aftermath of a strike that went exactly the way the There is a specific reason the Belma is being hunted with a $5 million helicopter, $300,000 of missiles, and enough electronic support to steer the entire engagement. She could, in theory, be sunk from 100 miles away. She could be sunk by a torpedo. She could be sunk by a much larger anti-ship missile fired from a warship over the horizon. The technical problem of putting a very large hole in a very large ship has been solved for about a century. What is difficult is doing it without killing anyone. A modern supertanker carries a crew of somewhere between 15 and 25 people. On most vessels out of Kharg, that crew is a mix of nationalities, none of them Iranian, Filipino, Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Ukrainian, Georgian, men and women who signed on to a shipping company in Manila or Mumbai to feed their families, and were not, in most cases, told what cargo they would be moving or where it was really going. They are hostages of the trade. An engine room, on any ship at sea, is manned around the clock. International safety regulations require it. On a vessel the size of the Belma, that means an engineer, an oiler, and an electrician on watch every single hour of every single voyage. If you put a 200-pound warhead into that compartment, you kill those 3 people, and you also kill anyone in the adjacent machinery spaces, and you almost certainly injure or kill more of the deck crew from the concussion. For most of the first 2 years of enforcement, the American targeting doctrine assumed that this was an acceptable cost. And then, according to open-source reporting on incidents earlier this year, that assumption changed. A strike conducted in the early summer, analysts have pieced it together from AIS data, satellite imagery, and post-incident salvage reporting, put a missile into the engine room of a Shadow Fleet tanker crossing the northern Gulf. The ship was disabled. She was also, by the time the smoke cleared, missing part of her crew. The specifics of who was aboard and how many died and which nationalities are still being worked through by the various governments and shipping unions involved. What is clear is that the political fallout was immediate, because the argument for enforcing a blockade against Iranian oil has always been that the target of the blockade is the Iranian state, and specifically the revenue streams funding the ballistic missile and drone programs. Is not the deckhand from Cebu, who was hired last month to paint valves. When that deckhand ends up dead on the front page of a newspaper in Manila, the entire political architecture of enforcement starts to wobble. So somewhere inside the U.S. Navy targeting cell, the room where officers and lawyers and intelligence analysts sit together deciding exactly which piece of a ship a missile is going to hit, the aim point moved. Off the machinery space. Off the engine room. Off any compartment where a crewman might reasonably be standing. Onto a 10-foot steel box, 130 feet above the waterline, on the tallest structure of the ship. The one part of the vessel that stays empty around the clock. The one part of the vessel that, if you shred it, ends the voyage. The funnel. Understanding why the funnel works as a target requires understanding what a supertanker's funnel actually is, which is not, as most people assume, a decorative smokestack. It is the exhaust trunking of the main marine diesel engine. 10 stories of steel casing wrapped around the vertical piping that carries combustion gases up from the engine block below, along with the auxiliary uptakes for the generators. Is the engine's windpipe. And a 2-stroke marine diesel that cannot exhaust cannot run. Cut the windpipe, and the ship stops. Not sinks, stops, which turns out to be exactly what an enforcement blockade needs. The cargo tanks below, incidentally, are pumped full of inert gas, cooled engine exhaust scrubbed below 5% oxygen, so a warhead into a tank simply punches a hole and accomplishes nothing else. The vulnerability the doctrine cared about for decades was the machinery. The vulnerability the doctrine now cares about is the pipe above it. The problem is that the funnel is not an easy target. It is small. It is high. It is protected from most angles by the ship itself. And on a day when the Coastal Defense Network has spotters, radars, missiles, and speedboats all pointed at the aircraft trying to line up the shot, hitting a 10-foot box from 3 miles away requires an 11-second window of absolute stillness in the air. 11 seconds is a very long time when you are being shot at. The Hellfire missile was not, originally, a weapon for this kind of work. It was designed in the 1970s as an anti-tank weapon, small enough to hang under the wings of a helicopter, precise enough to guide onto a Soviet main battle tank at a range that kept the launching aircraft outside of anti-air envelopes. The full designation is the AGM-114, and the H in Hellfire stands in the original documentation for helicopter-launched fire and forget. Neither part turned out to be entirely accurate. Most modern Hellfire variants are semi-active laser-guided. They need somebody to hold a laser designator on the target for the entire flight, and by the 2010s, the missile was being fired from almost every platform in the American arsenal that had a rail long enough to carry it. What makes it particularly useful against a ship is the seeker. The AGM-114 rides a beam of near-infrared light, pulsing at a specific coded rhythm, at a wavelength of 1.064 microns, past the cutoff of the human eye. The seeker in the missile's nose is not looking for heat or metal or a shape, is looking for that exact coded blink pattern reflecting off a target. Anything that does not blink in that exact rhythm gets ignored. The missile is chasing a sparkling barcode painted on steel, which means the whole engagement stands or falls on the aircraft's ability to hold the laser on the aim point. On a moving helicopter at 3 miles against a target moving at 5.5 knots with wind buffeting the airframe, this is not an act of steady aim. It is an act of computational choreography. A stabilized sensor turret under the nose of the Seahawk holds the beam. Fine motors inside the mount eat every jitter of the airframe. What the pilot has to do is give the turret a stable enough platform to work with, no aggressive turns, no violent altitude changes, for the 11 seconds it takes the missile to fly. 11 seconds of straight and level flight in the open, over water, with an Iranian long-range radar to the north trying very hard to find a firing bearing. The tanker is fighting the shot without meaning to. The plume of diesel soot standing off the top of her funnel is composed of particles almost exactly the wrong size, 1/10 of a micron to a full micron across, precisely the range that scatters near-infrared light hardest. 30 feet of thick plume can cut the returning laser pulse to 1/100th of its original strength. A missile that loses its pulse pattern coasts blind for the last few seconds of its flight, which, at Mach plus speeds, is enough to walk at 30 or 40 feet off its intended point of impact. The solution this afternoon is wind. The wind in the Persian Gulf, on the afternoon of the engagement, is coming out of the northwest at roughly 15 knots. Enough to stream the funnel plume off the far side of the stack, downwind, away from the American laser. That leaves the windward face of the funnel, the north side, clean, sooty in patches, but not smoked in. The pilot brings a helicopter around to that side, offsets a few hundred feet upwind, holds altitude, and gives the turret the 11 seconds it needs. There is no clever version of what happens next. The first Hellfire leaves the rail at a little past Mach 1 before the smoke clears the tube. It arcs upward, then noses into a shallow dive of about 20 to 30 degrees, flat enough to punch into the side of the funnel casing rather than sail over the top. 3 seconds later, the second Hellfire follows on a nearly identical track. Marking the same steel twice pushes the odds of a full stop above 99%. The pair costs about $300,000. The cargo they are protecting the target from delivering is worth close to $140 million. The first missile buries itself in the side of the Belma's funnel. The casing blooms outward in a fan of shredded steel. The second missile threads the smoke of the first and tears into the other half of the breach. The impacts, seen from a mile away, look almost gentle. There is no fireball. There is no torn hull below the waterline. There does not need to be. 12 decks down on the bridge of the Belma, the deck shudders once. The engine note cuts out. The steering repeats a fault. And somewhere in the compartments below, marine engineers who have felt an engine die more times than they can count are already reaching for the emergency isolation switches on a machine that is not going to come back on this voyage. Nobody on a supertanker with a wrecked funnel does not sink. She drifts. Without propulsion, the Belma turns slowly with the wind and current, holding her heading only as long as the residual momentum of a 250,000-ton vessel keeps her aligned. Within an hour, she will be broadside to the swell. Within 4, she will be well outside the loading approach to Kharg, drifting slowly toward international waters that nobody involved in the encounter particularly wants her to reach. A tug will be dispatched eventually. The cargo, in one form or another, will be salvaged. Some fraction of it will be moved through ship-to-ship transfer to a different hull, painted with a different name, flying a different flag. Sanction crude does not evaporate. It just changes barcodes. That is the part of the story that does not make it into the operational briefing. Every element of the 11 minutes that led to the Belma's funnel being pried open, the Shadow Fleet's chain of shell companies, the coastal defense network built out of decommissioned oil platforms, the shoulder-fire missile whose price tag would embarrass a hardware store, the doctrine that moved the American aim point off the engine room after somebody died, is downstream of a single economic fact. Kharg is still pumping. The customers are still buying. The revenue is still flowing into the ballistic missile program and the drone program and every other line item that the sanctions are supposed to be starving. A single tanker disabled on any given afternoon is a rounding error in that revenue stream. It costs Iran the delivery. It costs Iran arguably a small increase in the risk premium on the next cargo. It does not cost Iran the trade, which raises a question the American planners have been unable to answer publicly for the better part of a decade. If the sanctions regime cannot stop the physical oil from moving, and the enforcement regime can only intercept at best a small percentage of the vessels moving that oil, and every intercepted vessel gets replaced from an inventory of hundreds, then what exactly is the enforcement blockade for? There are answers. The most honest of them is that the blockade is a political instrument, not a physical one. Every intercepted tanker is a headline. Every headline is a reminder to Tehran, to Beijing, to the ports in Fujairah and Singapore and elsewhere that quietly receive Shadow Fleet cargoes, that the enforcement is real, even if the arithmetic does not close. The math is not the point. The message is. But underneath the message, the barcode economy grinds on. Come back for a moment to the opening of this video. A helicopter at 50 feet. A tanker riding high. A hand-cranked autocannon on a rusted platform, waiting 12 days for a target worth the ammunition. A man on a walkway with a pair of binoculars and a solar-powered radio, calling a bearing that shrinks a 17-mile radar box down to a firing solution. None of that changes tomorrow. None of it changes the day after. Somewhere along the coast tonight, a spotter is sipping tea and watching the shipping lanes. Somewhere out on the water tonight, a hull with a fresh coat of paint and a hand-typed destination in her transponder is leaving Kharg with a load nobody wants to sign for. And somewhere at a targeting cell across the Gulf, a young officer with a coffee is pulling up the AIS track of a ship that has been called 4 different things in 3 years and asking very quietly whether this is the one worth spending $300,000 on today. The economy is not going anywhere. The engagement will happen again. The paint will be dry by the weekend. If you got something out of this breakdown, 3 quick things. Hit like. It genuinely does move the algorithm on long-form pieces like this one. Subscribe. Next episode is going to pick up on a related thread, and if you're subscribed, it will find you. And leave a comment on one of these questions. Do you think the American shift to funnel strikes is a genuine ethical calibration or a cynical adjustment to keep the blockade politically viable? Would you take the deckhand's job on a Shadow Fleet tanker if the money doubled? And what do you think Iran's next move looks like once the funnel strike stops being a surprise? The wind is still coming out of the northwest tonight. Somebody, somewhere, is loading the next cargo. We'll see you in the next one.